What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Common Sense Living, the show where we discuss financial and economic trends, gold and silver, and various business topics. Before we get started today, please go ahead, hit that like button. It helps the channel out. I greatly appreciate it. So, today I want to discuss modern monetary theory, what it is, why it became popular, and why, if it continues, its impact is going to be devastating for the US economy. So basically, what modern monetary theory is, it's an economic theory, and it says that government spending, and this is fiscal, so it's not the Federal Reserve, should not be, so government spending should not be constrained by fear of rising debt. So, in other words, don't worry about spending, don't worry about debt. Now, you may ask yourself, how could anyone be so crazy, and how could something so illogical even exist? And my belief on this whole crazy theory is that the government simply wants an excuse to spend as much as possible with no repercussions. Now, we've recently seen this be implemented and be tested. The most recent example is obviously COVID, where stimulus checks were being sent out to people. Productivity dropped immensely, and now we're seeing high inflation and everyday people hurting because the growth that came through the fiscal stimulus, there wasn't any productivity attached to it. It was simply just money, the government just handing out money to people. So I'm going to go through and try and explain their thought process, and then after that, we can easily debunk their points. Now, their thought process is essentially that the primary risk from going out and doing um, something like this is that inflation can be a risk, and of course, we've seen it be a risk. Um, but once it becomes a risk, what they can do is that essentially they can tax people. It's going to reduce spending and then ultimately lower inflation. So the theory here, in other words, is that the government can print, they can put out as much money as they'd like to through various programs. And essentially, if this leads to inflation, what they can do is simply just increase taxes. That's going to increase government revenue. And essentially, people are not going to be spending as much. It's just going to naturally lower inflation. But we're going to see that this logic, while it may sound good, it's severely flawed. So the first assumption with modern monetary theory, it's that debts and deficits don't matter. And this is just completely false. And we're seeing we're seeing what's happening right now with just our interest payments on the national debt. They're going up by huge amounts every year, and it's projected to just keep increasing, keep ever increasing. But what's more obvious here than anything, and I mentioned this prior, is the stimulus handouts given for COVID. So we have a current recent example of fiscal policy causing inflation by putting so much money in the economy. Now, you can come out and say, well, obviously the Fed is at fault here too, but with the amount of money that the government's put out on the fiscal end, that's been a huge contributor as well. In my opinion, the Fed has just left interest rates for too low for too long. And anytime there's any sort of, you know, some sort of situation where the economy may start breaching a contraction, they're just going to start lowering interest rates. They just get scared, they cave to Wall Street and everyone else, and they'll lower interest rates. What they should be doing is they should be keeping them high. They should be concerned with, instead of having such low interest rates, keeping them at a more moderate level. Now, the second assumption here is that inflation can be controlled through taxation. So inflation exists from the money supply. That's, this is not tough logic to figure out. As more dollars exist, the relative value of each dollar drops. And you can come up with any theory or mathematical equation for that, but that's just a simple fact. If there's more dollars in the economy, um, more dollars, then they're going to be worth less. And it's a simple concept. Uh, Taxation completely ignores this importance. So, taxation, another thing I want to mention is that taxation cannot solve inflation. Taxation, it hurts small businesses, it hurts entrepreneurships because they're always going to get the brunt of it. And that's what really drives economic growth. It's going to drive revenue, and everyone's standard of living is going to increase. So, with higher economic growth, you're going to have a higher GDP, and the government's just naturally going to collect more in taxes because people will be spending. There's going to be more consumption. People are going to be out and about doing things. So the key here is that productivity ultimately drives higher government growth, higher government revenue, not taxes. And we've seen this before. And if people are struggling, then taxing them, it's not going to matter. It's not going to help in terms of what's happening. Now, another thing that really we have to take into account with this flawed theory is that wages don't keep up when the government is spending and there's simply no concern for deficit or debt. And we've seen this the last few years through the pandemic, where the real wages are just not keeping up. The real interest rate is still negative. So just your average person who just wants to save a little money from each paycheck, um, they can't get that positive real rate of return like they once could. Now, there's other factors to consider as well with this debt, with the debt and deficits. Um, it can't keep going. We're going to be passing it on to future generations, and it's going to be hurting them. And all these factors, these are things that just prove that modern monetary theory, it really shouldn't be even considered or discussed. I have a tough time really respecting anyone who stands up for this theory or really thinks that there's any validity to it. But that's all I've got for today. I appreciate everyone's time, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. Like the video as well if you enjoyed it, and please comment if you have any feedback. I enjoy hearing everyone's opinion. Thanks a lot.